talk about this book called The People's Panel, and this is by Richard D. Younger, printed in 1963. And I have searched and searched and searched the internet, and I cannot find this book but in one place, and that's on hathitrust.org. And you can just search The People's Panel, Richard D. Younger, and it'll come up. Now, unfortunately, this site does not let you download the entire book, but it'll let you download like page by page in a PDF. So if you wanted to print out this book, it would be difficult to do that. Doing it this way, because it's just a lot. It's just a lot to be able to do it. So I had a few copies in my on my computer. So I'm going to use this one. This looks like to be the best one. These are kind of sideways and stuff. So I'm going to use this one. But if you want to just read it, you can go to HathiTrust. And you can read it from here, or you can purchase the book, okay? Now, what this book is about is how the people of the colonies formed grand juries, and the people, the common people, not the people in the government, but the common man, the common people in the common communities would get together, and they would form grand juries. And in these grand juries, they would charge the politicians or the people in public service with crimes. Now, people in public service are those people working for the government. Okay? So I'm just going to go through. This is an old book, so I think I can just read and go through some of the things. Okay, so that was just one page. That was the page that downloaded from HathiTrust. Okay, so I have the highlights in my book, my hard copy that I have here, but I'll bring this up and you can sort of read through as I go. So I hope this is the same version that I have. I'm not sure. So this says, at the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, Henry II provided that 12 knights or 12 good and lawful men of every 100 and 4 lawful men of every ville, I think that means village, disclose under oath the names of those in the community believed guilty of criminal offenses. So basically tattletelling, which is what our government wants us to do today. Okay, members of this inquisitorial body were obliged to present to the judge sworn accusations against all suspected offenders. Okay, so just, tattletelling. Unlike petit juries, grand juries were not to pass upon guilt or innocence, but were to decide only whether an individual should be brought to trial. Okay, so now we have grand juries now, but these grand juries are controlled by the corporate courts. And these courts are not established by the government. They appear to be government, but they're corporations who are registered as doing business with the government to provide a service to the government. And like any other business registered to do business with the government, they're regulated by the government. So they look like a government. Some of these look like government offices, but they're not. They're just corporations. The jurors then heard only witnesses against the accused, and if they were convinced that there were grounds for trial, indicted them. They also passed upon indictments laid before them by Crown prosecutors returning a true bill. Okay, a true bill. So today we have grand juries that are controlled, which keeps the really bad people out of jail, and basically us, who are supposed to be in control of the grand juries, out of the grand juries so that they can protect it. And then they have us use us against each other, and then they figure out who they want on the grand juries depending on what kind of person you are and how you're going to see the evidence. So it says it gradually became instead a strong independent power guarding the rights of the English people. The juries did not have to divulge to the court the evidence upon which they acted, and when royal officials abused their authority, they intervened to protect citizens from unfounded accusations. With the growth of royal absolutism in England, now absolutism means arbitrary power, okay? So arbitrary power is jurisdiction with the lowercase j. I've talked about this in some of my other videos. That's why in the United States, they have jurisdiction with a capital J, which is capital P, power, and capital A, authority, which are those things listed in the Constitution where their powers are limited and defined. Okay, so there is no arbitrary power in the United States or in America or in the States. Okay. Let's see, highly prized as defenders of the liberties of the people and shields against royal prosecution. So in America, this was the shield against the government, and it was supposed to be ran by the people, and it at first was ran by the people, but then was taken over by the government or their corporations, and now they keep it as their power. The refusal in 1681 of a grand jury to indict Lord Shaftesbury on charges of treason in spite of the insistence of Charles II led Englishmen to look upon the grand jury system with increased respect. John Somers, Lord Chancellor of England, in his tract The Security of Englishmen's Lives, noted that grand juries are our only security, and as much as our lives cannot be drawn into jeopardy by all the malicious crafts of the devil, unless such a number of our honest countrymen shall be satisfied in the truth of the accusations. By the end of the 17th century, the grand jury had become an important bulwark of the rights and privileges of English citizens, because the citizens were still in charge of it. Okay, grand juries acted in the nature of local assemblies. So local assemblies, making known the wishes of the people, not the government, proposing new laws, protesting against abuses in government, performing administrative tasks, and looking after the welfare of their communities. They provided their effectiveness during the colonial and revolutionary periods. So it was good for the colonies and the revolutionary period, but it's not good enough now, right? In helping the colonists resist imperial interference. They provided a similar source of strength against outside pressure in the territories of the Western United States. So I believe that when they did the Constitution, that's when they first started taking over people's rights to the grand jury. And it was done slowly by usurpation of power. It wasn't something that happened all at once. Okay, now you can, of course, come here and find this book and read it yourself. I'm just going to sort of hit on some things to make my point. And I encourage you to read this book in its entirety. It's really interesting. It goes by pretty fast. It's a little bit thick. It's not too bad, though. The English colonies in America patterned their legal institution after those of the mother country, and each adopted the grand jury as part of its judicial system. Now, again, when they adopted the grand jury, it was directly in the hands of the people. The people formed the grand jury spontaneously on their own without government interference, local or federal or state. Okay, so if you wanted to bring in a contractor who was working for the government, who overcharged the government, And those people that were involved in hiring the contractors, and maybe they received part of the profit for having hired them, then you would bring all of them in. You would form a jury and bring all of them in and charge them with their crimes. And this grand jury at this time, they would hang people for those kinds of things. Let's see, it says down here, the sheriff or the county court named the grand jurors. The selection tended to be made from the large landowners. This was particularly true of juries attending the provincial courts held at colonial capitals. Sheriffs selected panels from the immediate vicinity of the capital and generally ignored the western areas. Okay, now that wasn't always the case. It wasn't always left to the sheriff. Colonial legislators imposed fines on jurymen for failing to appear at the court or upon officers for neglecting to summon grand jurors. So this is when a lot of the stuff started happening that that became a problem, because they were forcing people to come in and hear cases when these people had to travel for long periods of time over areas that the roads weren't paved, or they were riding on horses. They had no money. They got there. They had no food. They had no lodging. And so this became a real problem. Now, before that, the grand juries were composed of just people who got together in an assembly. And then later on, they started leaving it to the sheriff, but then the sheriff would call people from far away because he couldn't even get the local people to come in and sit on the juries. Because they were getting people to sit on juries for things that they weren't interested in being a part of. You know, it didn't matter to them, some of the things that were being done. And so when you ask people to fight in a war that is not a war that protects them or their lands, but a war that protects someone somewhere else and their property, you're not going to get very many people to come in and volunteer to fight in that war. And that was the problem that they were having here. They were trying to get people to come in and sit on these grand juries, and people, it just wasn't worth it to them to travel all that way, to sleep outside, to not have any foods accessible to them, or if there were food, like places to eat, there were no, they had no money. These were poor farmers and stuff, because, back then they didn't have, the cities back then weren't the way they are now. Okay, so it just wasn't worthwhile for people to come in. So the sheriff, then they started trying to use the sheriff to get people to come in. And that didn't work well either. So the grand jury system of Connecticut developed on different lines than those of Massachusetts or Plymouth. So every state had their own sort of system of how they did things. From the earliest period, the colony made use of the information, a written accusation filed in the court by a prosecuting officer acting under oath. Juries confined themselves almost entirely to capital cases, and the town meetings did not elect jurors. In 1643, an order of the general court providing for the first grand jury required the clerk of the general court to warn 12 men to appear at each September session. In 1666, the general court established a system of county courts and ordered each of these courts to appoint a grand jury of at least 12 men to appear at each session. The only restriction placed upon the court's power of appointment was that every plantation and the respective counties had to be represented. In 1680, the general court ordered all grand jurors to serve for 1 year. Okay, it's kind of a long time if you're supposed to be farming your land. After warning letters from the governor proved ineffectual, a law was finally passed in 1677 providing that any justice of the peace who neglected to swear a jury of inquest before the 1st of April each year be fined 2,000 pounds of tobacco and that any grand juryman not appearing to be fined 200 pounds of tobacco. In spite of the system of fines, Governor Thomas Culpeper found it necessary to issue a proclamation in 1682 ordering that all grand jury presentments found within the previous year be sent to the general court. The governor complained that the laws were not being enforced because the justices failed to summon juries, and jurors in turn failed to make presentments. You know, I don't know about you, but I think if somebody told me that I had to travel on horse 100 miles on a road that wasn't paved, and sleep outside and not get paid and have no food available to me, or they were going to find me, I would feel like I was being asked to do something that was impossible. And according to the maxims of law, which are truths, which are law, you cannot ask someone to do something that's impossible. Man cannot be compelled to do that which is impossible. So I can't leave my family and my farm and jeopardize my entire life to go sit on a grand jury just because you're threatening to fine me 200 pounds of tobacco. So this just wasn't going to work. You can't force people to do things, to give up their entire lives to do something that they didn't want to do anyway. In the period after 1700, the American colonists gradually came to realize the value of the grand juries as a means of obtaining redress of grievances from proprietors and of opposing the power of royal officials. But this did not mean that groups in control of the various colonies now wanted juries to become an instrument of democratic government with jury service open to all. They did not wish to see the powers of grand juries restricted to royal courts and royal officials, but they did not want to select those who would sit on them. But they did want to select those who sit on them. In Boston in 1702, Cotton Mather attempted to rectify the gross abuse in the choice of jurymen by the town meeting. As a result, the selectmen of the town each year presented the town meeting a list of persons whom they deemed proper to serve on juries. Only persons on this list could be nominated for service. In New York, the legislature renewed a temporary statute of 1699, placing a property qualification on the right to serve as a grand juror. The Assembly of New Jersey directed sheriffs to summon only those persons worth at least 100 pounds in real estate located in the county in which they served. The Pennsylvania Assembly tried in 1700 and again in 1705 to restrict the jurisdiction of grand juries by taking away their power to present matters which a justice of the peace could determine, but the Queen in council vetoed both measures. In the southern colonies, the sheriffs and justices selected grand jurors from the better classes in coastal areas. The North Carolina Assembly, in an address to the governor made in 1626, complained that illegal grand juries, particularly in the outlying areas, vilified and damaged the reputation of members of the Assembly. The legislators objected to the use of grand jury presentments for merely petitioning redress of grievances, one of your fundamental rights. The court's instructions and in the argument that ensued claimed loudly that all grand juries enjoyed the right of sending for and examining under oath whomsoever they pleased, touching what matters they thought fit. After a heated debate between the bench and the jurors, the judge dismissed the grand jury and adjourned the court. And so if the judge doesn't get his way, he just dismisses you. Well, I would form another grand jury and dismiss the judge. Okay, and then we go to the Revolution. Okay, Revolutionary period. And this book goes through time, so you see it changes, you know, as they try to figure out how this is best going to work until we get to now, where we have corporations in charge of the government, corporations in charge of the courts, corporations in charge of our lives, our property and everything, where it had originally started back with the queen or the king, and then moved through the colonies, and the sheriffs and the legislators get involved and all these things. So originally here, though, it was just ran by the people. In the grand jury, discontented American colonists had discovered a potent weapon which to harass royal officials and protest against British authority. The power of the juries lay in their ability to block criminal proceedings begun by royal officials. Simply by refusing to find a true bill, they could effectively prevent the enforcement of criminal statutes, among them the laws regulating trade, and it was no secret that colonial juries were prejudiced in favor of smugglers and patriotic mob leaders. This prejudice was particularly potent in Boston, where the radical-dominated town meeting selected jurors who could be depended upon to set aside the weight of evidence and do what was expected of them. So I'd like to go back to here, smugglers and patriotic mob leaders. That's how corporations would define the free market. The free market is what the common man would want. And the free market is one of our natural rights. We have a natural right to trade freely amongst each other and not have that controlled. As a matter of fact, the definition of a republic is a commonwealth, and the definition of a commonwealth, one of them is anti-monopolistic government. So the government would not support monopolies, nor would it run monopolies, and that's what a commonwealth is, and that's what a republic is. And in the Constitution, it says you're guaranteed a republic. But people believe that when the government says that they're going to tax and they're going to control commerce, that means they can tax everyone and control all commerce. Whereas if you continue reading Article 1, Section 8, you see that they're only supposed to tax themselves on their own lands and control the commerce that comes on and off their lands. Because if they did it in the entire country, then that would be a monopoly. On the eve of the revolution, local grand juries were in an excellent position to take the lead in opposing the imperial government. Jurors refused to indict the leaders of the Swamp Act riots. Okay, so when the common people start acting out, and then the common people are the one that form the grand juries, they don't indict themselves for taking over bad government. Okay, the answer to maintaining a good government is to put the power in the hands of the common man, the common people. But when the power is taken out of the common people and put into a corporation, such as the ones that run our courts, then the people have no power and they have no control over the government, and then the government becomes tyrannical, just as it has these days. And if you don't see that, then maybe you need to wake up, have somebody wake you up. Let's see, because being conscious means being awake. Being unconscious means being asleep. That's the definition. So the popular party easily dominated juries chosen by the town meetings. It was now the turn of royal officials to block criminal prosecutions. The Attorney General refused to prosecute them. And I'm just going through reading some of the stuff I highlighted. A daring breach of trust and an insupportable grievance. Ignoramus. So this is the assembly and the town meeting could do little except protest, but the grand juries kept up their end of the dispute by continuing to return ignoramus all bills laid before them by the judge of royal prosecutor. So they would write ignoramus. The way I understand this is they would write ignoramus on the bill and send it back. What I do when they write to me is I put no contract on it and I send it back. Maybe I should start adding this to it. While the status of Chief Justice Oliver was in dispute, the British government took steps to end once and for all his harassing tactics of the Massachusetts grand juries. Chief Justice William Henry Drayton of South Carolina quickly recognized the propaganda value of patriotic grand juries. During the winter of 1774 and 1775, he traveled from district to district in Upper South Carolina, urging the people to assert their rights and maintain their freedom. Because that's how you maintain your freedom, is when these people act in ways that are anti-freedom. You're supposed to form a local grand jury and control them and put them in jail, or in some cases they would historically be hung. Drayton was not disappointed in the reaction of his efforts. The grand juries of the Camden district responded with a veritable little declaration of independence in which they denounced the most dangerous and alarming nature of the power exercised by Parliament to tax and legislate for the American colonies. Other grand juries answered the Chief Justice's address by returning equally stirring pronouncements. So this would be 35. Grand juries in other colonies followed the lead of those in South Carolina. New York City jurors issued a protest in February 1775 against the many oppressive acts of Parliament, citing for special condemnation the law establishing admiralty courts and the act providing for the payment of judicial salaries by the Crown. Grand juries of Newcastle, Delaware took a more practical approach in the dispute with England. They agreed to vote for and promote a tax of 1 shilling and 6 to the pound on all taxable property. Money thus collected would constitute a fund for the defense of Delaware and our brethren in the other colonies. In Rhode Island, the legislature required grand juries to report any person who declares their late king to be their rightful lord and sovereign. The colonists still had to win their freedom on the battlefield, okay, because remember, we're talking about the Revolution. The Chief Justice said that the cause of independence could be powerfully aided by an alert grand jury. The jurors congratulated the Continental Congress on its declaration. Grand juries did much to prevent anarchy and the interregnum between royal and state government. In short, the tradition of their colonial forerunners, grand juries, representing the people of each community, continued to preserve order and watch over local affairs during the course of the Revolution. So the grand juries formed locally by the people continued to preserve order and watch over local affairs, but it was the order that they wanted, not the order that government demanded. An odious instrument of British tyranny, while at the same time they had hailed indictment by a grand jury as one of their rights as Englishmen. As a guide to their deliberations, Judge Ashe defined the crime of treason and listed the punishments for counterfeiting public bills of credit. Wives of British soldiers who remained in the city. The jurors charged that they continued to correspond with their husbands, providing the British Army with valuable intelligence. After the British retreat from before the city, Philadelphia juries continued to indict for informing the English in New York. They restricted, to meet specific problems arising from the conflict, the wartime legislators of the new states often restricted the membership or added to the duties of the Grand Inquest. Okay, so now we have a new nation. Let's see. The institution had proved valuable indeed in opposing the imperial government, and indictment by a grand jury had assumed the position of a cherished right. Okay, so it's a cherished right. It's a natural right. It should be included in one of all of our rights, not just the 10 protected by the Constitution, but all of them. In 1783, a South Carolina grand jury complained that most people were at a loss to explain the fee system used by attorneys. It was far better than a few individuals should suffer rather than stigmatize a whole community for a want of faith and a total disregard to national honor. Shays' rebellion assumed serious proportions. Instead of seeking to alleviate the situation of those in revolt, the Massachusetts legislators suspended the writ of habeas corpus, declared the existence of a state of rebellion, and sent troops under General Benjamin Lincoln to crush all opposition. Although the legislature pardoned most of those who took part in the uprising, grand juries indicted the most prominent leaders of the movement for treason. Chief Justice Cushing delivered to grand juries violent triads against the rebel leaders, calling their attempt at revolution as foolish and rash as it was wicked and unprovoked. The Chief Justice declared that there could never be a reason for rising in arms against a free government such as that of Massachusetts. He went on to attribute the difficulties of the Western farmers to their own imprudence and extravagance and want of frugality and economy. At each court on his circuit, Cushing thanked the troops who had assisted in stamping out incipient treason. The Supreme Court had sentenced the insurgent leaders to death, but in June 1787, the legislature pardoned them. This led Cushing to lecture subsequent grand juries on the fatal consequences of suspending the execution of the traitors. But who are the traitors? Who defined what the traitors are? Is it someone who is bad or someone who is good? I mean, it just depends on what side you're on. Shays' rebellion acted as an important catalytic agent in hastening the call for a national constitutional convention. Chief Justice Nathaniel Pendleton told jurors of Georgia that he hoped the new Constitution would mark the beginning of a general reformation in the whole country, doing away with paper money and state laws that interfered with the right of contract. Judge John Grimmick of South Carolina warned Charleston grand jurors to anticipate the intrigues and secret combinations of our internal enemies who would seek to destroy the Constitution. Donning the garb of a prophet, Judge Grimmick predicted that future ages will honor the Constitution as the masterpiece of political wisdom. The Constitution of the United States, as it went into force in 1789, did not mention grand juries in any way. It was not at all certain that there would be separate grand inquest for the federal government because the Constitution did not require separate federal inferior courts. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention had discussed the details of a federal judiciary, but slightly. And I would like to disagree with this because it does say in the Constitution that the government shall only have jurisdiction over cases where they originate in Washington, D.C., being the seat of government, or the lands purchased. And they did not purchase the entire country. They only purchased the federal lands given to them by the states. Chief Justice Nathaniel Pendleton told jurors of Georgia that he hoped the new Constitution would mark the beginning of a general reformation. Okay, I read that. Front page. Federalist regarded inferior courts as one of the vital agencies for maintaining federal supremacy and for checking the pretensions of the states. But they also knew that many opposed establishments of lower federal courts. Vagueness of the use of general terms were used to confuse those who opposed the elaborate federal judiciary. As a result, the judicial article of the Constitution emerged as a broadly worded message that left much to be determined by Congress. Let's see, or am I? Oh, I'm on the wrong page. Okay, so Chief Justice Nathaniel Pendleton told jurors of Georgia that he hoped the new Constitution... Man, I'm just reading the same page over and over again. Okay, Federalist regarded inferior courts as one of the vital agencies for maintaining a federal supremacy and for checking the pretensions of the states. But they also knew that many opposed the establishment of lower federal courts. Vagueness and the use of general terms were used to confuse those who opposed an elaborate federal judiciary. As a result, the judicial article of the Constitution emerged as a broadly worded passage that left much to be determined by Congress. Governor Morris explained Federalist tactics regarding the judiciary, saying, "On that subject, it became necessary to select phrases which would not alarm others. To have defined clearly the relationship of federal to state courts might have raised an insuperable barrier to ratification. The necessity of an express guarantee of the right to indictment by a grand jury in all criminal cases became a disputed issue before several of the state ratifying conventions. Reminding delegates of their experiences with British officials, Abraham Holmes warned the Massachusetts Convention that an officer of the proposed new government would be able to file informations and bring any man to jeopardy of his life without indictment of a grand jury." Supporters of the Constitution did not deny this possibility, but reminded the objecting delegate that just because officers of the new government could abuse their authority did not mean that they would. Refusing to rely solely upon the integrity of future federal officials, the Massachusetts Convention recommended that the Constitution be amended to provide that no person could be tried for a capital offense unless previously indicted. At its first session in 1789, the first Congress under the Constitution proposed 12 indictments, among them an amendment guaranteeing the right to a grand jury indictment for all infamous or capital crimes. After ratification by the required number of states, this became a part of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Federalists were determined to take full advantage of the almost unlimited authority given Congress to establish inferior courts with jurisdiction equal to that of the Supreme Court. The Judiciary Act of 1789 provided that grand juries were to attend each session of the circuit and district courts. Federal marshals were responsible for choosing jurors by law or according to the method used by the state in which the court was sitting. Qualifications for grand jury duty also followed the laws of several states. Although federal marshals selected federal grand juries in the same manner as did the states and from among the same group of eligible citizens, there remained vital differences between the two. State grand juries were free to investigate and present to the court any criminal matter that violated the common law. Federal grand jurors were far more limited in scope of their investigations. They had the power to investigate and present only those offenses that violated specific federal laws. State grand juries operated at the county level where the jurors were familiar with conditions of their own communities. They regarded themselves as the appointed investigators of the people, and as much they did not hesitate to reprimand local officials or to suggest improvements and changes in local government. They often went far beyond mere law enforcement and dealt with community problems that touched the everyday lives of every one of them. Federal grand juries, however, because they were restricted to the investigation of statutory offenses, tended to become instruments of the central government rather than representatives of the people. Federal grand juries had little opportunity to become sufficiently familiar with the operation of the national government to check on the performance of federal officials or to suggest federal policies, as did their counterparts in the state courts. The grand jury functioned best in conjunction with government that was close to the people, and it lost much of its effectiveness for a centralized administration. So we hear Ron Paul talking about this all the time. The best government is the government that's closest to the people. From the first, the new federal judges regarded their addresses to grand juries as excellent opportunities to deliver political orations. Though grand jury charges originated for the purpose of instructing the jurors in their duties, judges had long used them as a means of disseminating political propaganda. English jurors had frequently given vent to their political feelings in grand jury charges. In colonial America, judges had usually lectured on political matters, while during the American Revolution, jury charges denounced England and the Loyalists had become an accepted and patriotic practice. In this tradition, Federalist jurists delighted in comparing the strength of the new Constitution with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Justice James Wilson joyously declared, "We now see the circle of government beautiful and complete." He congratulated the grand jurors of Philadelphia upon their new constitution, which under the power of the people is predominant and supreme. The newly appointed Chief Justice of the United States, Dr. John Jay, enthusiastically enumerated the advantages offered by the Constitution, which the previous government had proved too feeble and ill constructed to produce. Judge David Sewall painted a dramatic scene of discord, bloodshed, and foreign intervention for the edification of grand jurors in Portland, Maine, so they might know the perils from which the Constitution had rescued them. As early as April 1791, District Judge John Sitgreaves pointed with pride to reviving agriculture and commerce and to the increased stability of public and private credit, all resulting, he said, from the new national government. He called the attention of South Carolina grand jurors to the energy and stability of the central government in contrast to its previous impotence. All lies. Federal judges endeavored to impress upon the grand jurors the necessity for the strict enforcement of federal laws. So if they can get a hold of the grand juries, then they can basically do whatever they want, and there's no check and balance between the federal government and the juries. There's only a check and balance between just the government, the federal, judicial, and executive. But when you have those three not checking on themselves, but instead working together with each other, and then you have no grand juries to check on any three of them, then we end up with what we have today, which is absolute tyranny. Okay. But they returned few indictments for violations of federal laws, which is exactly what we know today to be true. It happens all the time. They investigate themselves and find themselves innocent. Following President Washington's Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, federal judges warned grand juries to present a persons guilty of violating the Neutrality Acts. In spite of judicial urgings, grand juries indicted only a few persons for violation of neutrality laws, and in almost every case brought to trial, the petit juries refused to convict. In some instances, popular celebrations greeted refusals to indict or convict. They replied in kind through the columns of their newspapers, accusing federal judges of converting the holy seat of law, reason, and equity into a rostrum from which they can harangue the populace under the pretense of instructing a grand jury. Let's see. Cabell's district in Western Virginia seethed with anger, and Thomas Jefferson, one of his constituents, charged that Federalist judges had perverted grand juries from a legal to a political engine by inviting them to become inquisitors on the freedom of speech. Seeking an effective means of protest, Jefferson, with the assistance of James Madison, drew up a petition of protest to be signed by the residents of Cabell's district. They planned to present the protest to the United States House of Representatives, but fear that a Federalist majority would pass a vote of approbation dissuaded them. A second choice, Jefferson laid the petition before the Virginia House of Delegates in August 1797. The petition censored the grand jury's action as a crime, wicked in its purpose and mortal in its consequence, tending to subvert the legislative department to the caprice of the judiciary. The Sedition Act passed by Congress in 1798 resulted from confusion over whether federal grand juries had the power to return indictments where a federal law had not been violated. Okay, so I'm going to skip through here a little bit because I don't want to just read the book to you. I want you to actually get the book and read it. And I think so far, maybe you're enticed. State and local grand juries, on the other hand, possessing full common law powers of investigation and indictment concerning themselves principally with the problems of local government, continued to be viewed as by most individuals as barriers between the citizen and the government, the role that had made them popular during the Revolution. Lawyers and jurists and utilitarian philosophers now replace the representatives of royal authority as its principal attackers. So my understanding of utilitarianism, if you don't know, is using people as a means to an end to get what you want, like lying to someone to get what you want. An admirer of grand juries praised them as protectors of liberty and warned that it would take a bold man to bring a bill into Parliament to abolish them. So they didn't. They just let corporations take over. The far more popular position in these early years of the new nation was that voiced by Justice James Wilson of the United States Supreme Court in a series of law lectures delivered in Philadelphia only 2 years earlier. Justice Wilson placed no limit upon the grand jury's area of inquiry. He viewed the inquest as an important instrument of democratic government. As Wilson saw it, the jury served as a great channel of communication between those who make and administer the laws and those for whom the laws are made and administered. Louisiana commissioned him to study and to revise and codify its criminal laws. The procedure provisions of the Complete Livingston Code confined grand juries to passing upon indictments submitted to them. But now we know, because of the laws passed, that the federal government can only summons people off federal lands when they commit a crime onto the federal lands. If you commit a crime on federal lands and you go off federal lands, then they can indict you or they can summons you, but they can't actually come off and get you. They have to go through the state. I am exceedingly pleased with the provision confining grand juries to the business of the penal law and not admitting any expression of opinion on other subjects. The Supreme Court of Missouri, however, upheld the jurors and declared that to hold otherwise would strip them of their greatest utility and convert them into a mere engine to be acted upon by circuit attorneys or those who might choose to use them. Okay, usury, utilitarianism, just using people, the corporations and the government using people as a means to an end instead of letting them have power over their own lives. In 1864, John M. Pomeroy, a professor of law at New York University, stated that the grand jury in the United States was an insuperable barrier against official oppression, and that the innovating hand of reform has not as yet touched the long established proceeding in criminal actions. The grand jury is carefully preserved by our national and state constitutions. The professor's conclusions were more hopeful than realistic. Most American legal scholars, many of them insisted that it had survived all possible usefulness, had joined their British brethren in the crusade to abolish the system. How sad. So in other words, the people have no means to protect themselves against a tyrannical government. They were basically just stripped of all their power by an overarching federal government. States that came into the Union before 1860, which retained the grand jury as an integral part of its legal and governmental machinery, and in those states the representative body that had proved useful in protesting the lack of self-government during the territorial period often became equally important as a voice of the people after statehood. Okay, and then the next section is on slavery, which I won't get into, not because it's not important, but I just didn't have any, I really didn't have any notes in this section. So chapter 8 is the Civil War and Reconstruction, page 106. Four, 5, 6. Okay, the juries served as sounding boards for both political and lay opinion on the aims and conduct of the war and as more or less effective checks to official and military excesses brought on by wartime conditions. They remained important law enforcement agencies and continued to propose solutions to the everyday problems of their communities. During the secession crisis and the days just preceding the opening of the war, while the sections were readying themselves for armed conflict, federal judges throughout the North hastened to deny the South's right to form a new nation. As judges had in the past, they chose their charges to grand juries as a means of making themselves heard. Judge David A. Smalley told jurors at New York City in January 1861 that the South may have had some cause for complaint, but he denied its right to secede. The pretended right to secession has no foundation in reason or the Constitution. And I disagree with that, of course, because if it's a contract or a treaty or anything that's agreed upon, and then the government is not doing what it agreed to do, then it's void. And that's just ancient law and good reasoning. Okay, so he denounced and unfounded all apprehensions that executive power threatened the people's liberties. But most of the stuff done now that is unconstitutional is done through the executive department. The IRS in their own laws state that they're supposed to tax the salaries and compensation of federal officers and employees, not the entire country. They don't have that power. So they go through the executive, they create a new IRS, and then they make it contractual. And so they make these forms. And these forms are the ones that they get you to sign. They tell you that they're required, and you sign them. And then after you sign them, it's a contract. The Lincoln administration earlier adopted and continued to practice a policy of arbitrarily arresting persons who voiced opposition to the war or appeared to be politically dangerous. This is in a book called, or some papers that you can find online, called The Arbitrary Arrests of Lincoln. And that's what he did. And he suspended the right of habeas corpus, which he never had the power to do. Okay. And if he did it, he suspended his power to do it, and so then he couldn't do it, which he never could have done it in the first place. Let's see. The new law did not end extralegal imprisonment. Federal officials continued to ignore the courts wherever possible. So, you know, the federal government made effort to end the grand jury and then just started throwing people in jail, just like the king did, and that was long after the Constitution. This was the Civil War. So they did use it as an arm of power against the people to strip them of their power. General Sherman warned the Memphis jurors that if they dared to indict persons for the hiring or assisting of runaway slaves, they would learn a lesson in politics that would last them to their dying day. Politics meaning, you know, that they can do what they want to you. The Confederate States of America simply took over the United States courts. The Tennessee jurymen also submitted to the court a list of alien enemies in the district whose property they believed should be confiscated. I'm going to go to chapter 9, page 134. Let's see. It consistently met the challenge of the new community problems, and it was declared so regularly that by the time of American entrance into World War I, vast areas of the country had ceased to use it. That was the grand jury. By the beginning of the war, to make the world safe for democracy, the grand jury did indeed seem to be a dying democratic institution. Okay, the new Jersey Law Journal predicted that it would be only a question of time before they would cease to exist, the grand juries. Most jurists who favored abolition served in the Northwest Territories or on the rural counties of Ontario areas where grand juries were little used. The expense and delay attending grand juries and called for a less cumbersome and more efficient method of bringing offenders to trial. Nowadays we have Zoom. We don't have to go anywhere, so there's really no excuse. And we live in a state of tyranny, so it would be beneficial right now to have grand juries, and it would be very easy to do it. In the United States, efforts to abolish the grand jury assumed almost epidemic proportions in the years following the Civil War. In the federal courts, however, in most states, grand juries had always been free to subpoena any and all witnesses on their own initiative. Chief Justice Simon P. Chase urged jurors convening in West Virginia in August 1868 to call before them and examine fully government officials or any other persons who possessed information useful to them. He warned that you must not be satisfied with acting upon such cases as may be brought before you by the district attorney or by members of your body. In view of Chief Justice Chase's statement of the board rule prevailing in the federal courts, it was indeed a strange doctrine that Justice Stephen Field announced in August 1872. Justice Field was the brother of well-known legal reformer and codifier David Dudley Field, who had sought to eliminate use of the grand jury in New York. The justice told a grand inquest in San Francisco, California, that they should limit their investigations to such matters as fell within their personal knowledge or were called to their attention by the court or prosecuting attorney. Those who wished to curb or eliminate the grand jury soon realized that abolishing the institution by law or constitutional amendment offered a better chance of success than did trying to restrict juries. I don't think they ever did that. Citing the Wisconsin decision with approval, the justices announced that due process of law included any system of prosecution which preserved liberty and justice and was not limited to indictment by a grand jury. Justice John M. Harlan's vigorous dissent stated the case for those who believed indictment by a grand jury of his neighbors to be the right of every American citizen. At a time when most legal scholars advised abandoning the grand jury inquest as an archaic relic to the distant past, a few defenders appeared. Judge Harmon Yerkes of Pennsylvania expressed the belief that the grand juries would provide a means of extending popular control over government. In September 1901, he told jurors of Bucks County that bodies such as theirs representing the people of the community were not outmoded or useless. In times of great public peril or in the event of deep-seated abuses, he observed, the divided yet powerful also combined responsibility of the secret session of the grand jury has worked out great problems of reform and correction. He pointed out that abolition of the grand inquest would leave the accused citizen completely at the mercy of an unjust or unwise judge or district attorney, or subject to the contrivances of unscrupulous prosecutors. Judge Yerkes dispelled the often repeated idea that because the United States was not ruled by a tyrannical king, grand juries had ceased to be necessary as guardians of individual liberty. He explained that tyrants even more irresponsible than the despots of old sought to dominate local, state, and national governments. Giant business monopolies restless of legal restraints and party bosses who did not hesitate to break judges and create courts, took the place of tyrannical monarchies as a danger to freedom in the United States. Against such ruthless forces, Judge Yerkes saw grand juries as powerful agencies of the people, challenging business or boss domination of government. Edward Lindsay of the American Institute of Criminal Law held broad inquisitorial powers as an essential part of judicial machinery, which could secure information otherwise unobtainable. Lindsay pointed out that prosecutors and police departments were at best feeble substitutes for the powerful grand inquest. Although Lindsay defended the grand juries against those who would have destroyed it, in doing so he adopted the criteria used by its critics. He sought to justify the institution on the grounds of efficiency. On this point, the grand jury was particularly vulnerable. Few persons familiar with its operation would have denied that a prosecuting officer could act with greater speed and singleness of purpose. Putnam became convinced that no other institution provided a degree of popular participation in government. He openly challenged the advice of ex-President Taft, announcing, "There is no other way citizens can bring criticism directly to bear upon public officials." Putnam viewed inquests as more than mere law enforcement bodies. During their term of office, jurors acted as representatives of the people of the county, and in that capacity could summon before them any public official, high or low. When such bodies ceased to exist, the publisher observed, the cause of popular government would have suffered a severe blow. In 1915, Putnam and others, convinced of the necessity of preserving the institution in America, organized the Grand Jury Association of New York County. They sought to publicize the importance of the grand inquest to democratic government and to blunt the attack on lay interference. And it appears that on page 158, possibly there are some steps, general procedures to grand jury indictments, at least to some extent. So people talk about the police, and we need the police, and this and that, and everything, and so possibly it's more about we need to restore the grand jury, who can act as a police force and probably do a better job because they know their community. Okay, they approved resolutions appointing an executive committee of 70 to gather evidence to oust corrupt officials. But the committee lacked the necessary powers to launch a widespread investigation. It was not until the grand jury began a thorough inquiry into municipal corruption that the Tweed Ring was in real danger. A grand jury's broad authority to subpoena witnesses and books, which are logs, made effective by its contempt powers and ability to indict for pre-jury, enabled it to obtain evidence in spite of the elaborate efforts of Tammany politicians to hide their operations. The secrecy that attended all investigating sessions made it possible for witnesses who feared reprisals to disclose safely what they knew. Okay. They had the satisfaction of knowing that their work would end an era of municipal corporation which had proved so costly to New York City taxpayers. They were able to end it through the grand jury, end corruption through the grand jury. But we don't form grand juries anymore, not the grand juries of the people. A lack of disposition to prosecute or a lack of efficiency on the part of the district attorney. The effectiveness with which a grand jury was able to investigate well-organized and large-scale corruption was dependent to some extent upon the cooperation of the county prosecutor. Persons ordered to appear under subpoena of the foreman disappeared from the city, and witnesses hesitated to talk in the district attorney's presence for fear they would go on the Tammany blacklist. The jurors began to subpoena their witnesses directly, refusing to go through the district attorney's office. And there's one last section in here that I want to go over. If I can find it. I may have read it already. Yeah, I think I read it already. It was about the grand jury being a powerful force in the hands of the people. Yep. So that's this book. So this is at hathitrust.org, and it's called The People's Panel, the Grand Jury in the United States, 1634 to 1941, how it was a tool used by the people directly in their hands to control the forces of power from doing evil. And it's a really good book. It's an interesting history of how the power was taken from the people and put into the hands of government, supposedly. I say that if you actually read the Constitution and not go through case law and such, because case law tends to be fiction, as one of my other book reviews shows, and because it's opinions, and opinions are often skewed by the judge's own self-interest, such as with Chief Justice Joseph Story, who was a land speculator and sat on land speculation cases so that he could judge in such a way that whatever he was doing would not be considered illegal anytime later on down the line, even though sitting on land speculation cases when you're a land speculator would be a conflict of interest. As far as his position of a chief justice goes. So this, the Constitution is, I say read it and understand the words and phrases. If you just don't have time to do the research, you can always watch my videos and watch other videos that say other things. I show you definitions and encyclopedia entries, and I show you case law, and I show you congressional records, and I show you books written by lawyers. I show you books written by researchers. I show you everything I get and where I get it, and I try to explain what it all means so that people can better understand it. But if this is not your cup of tea, that's fine. You can go look somewhere else. But I think the information that I give you is freedom bent, and I am a person who would like to see more freedom in this country and less corruption and tyranny and less takeover by corporations. So as always, I ask you to please like, share, and subscribe. If you don't want to do 2 of those, at least do 1 of those and share. That way, hopefully my videos will fall into the hands of people who are looking for this kind of information. You never know who it's going to help out. And with that, have a great day. I'll see you next time. Bye.